Well, good morning. We return to the book of Judges today. I think Peter, was it First Chronicles he was in? First Samuel, the last couple of weeks, something like that. Anyway, and probably one of the more famous episodes from the book of Judges, at least as far as Sunday school would be. We remember the story of Samson and Delilah. Did you see Samson in the background up there on the screen? That was kind of a cool little thing I discovered this week. Probably this week and next week. Next week we will talk about Samson's death, and then we'll move into the final 5 chapters of the book of Judges, and I still don't know about titles or exactly how I'm going to approach that. I remember I introduced it to you as the final 5, just really despicable stories that we see there, and I'm not sure where we're going to go, but we'll see what God has for us. But today for Judges chapter 16, as well known as this story of Samson and Delilah is, it's really only 22 verses long. And there's a little short story that happens in the first couple verses that we'll see this morning. But I remember as we were beginning to talk about Samson a few weeks ago, I said, there's 3 things that I wanted us to remember that the author has pointed out to us about Samson as we move into these final couple chapters. The first thing, and probably the most important, was his relationship with that Nazirite vow that he had. Remember, he couldn't cut his hair, he was not allowed to touch dead bodies, and he was not allowed to have alcohol or even eat grapes and the skins and all that sort of thing. And we're going to see that we know that he's already broken a couple of those things. We pointed that out a few weeks ago. And today, the last thing that has to do with his hair, you guys know this story as well as I do. We'll see that as well. So that was the first thing, his nature of his relationship with that Nazirite vow. The second thing was we wanted to note either the presence or the absence of the Spirit of the Lord in Samson's life. When it comes to the judges, we see the presence of the Spirit of the Lord more than any of the other judges. It happens a couple times, but at least in Samson, I think it's at least 4 times that we see that. But we also want to take note when Samson does something and it doesn't say that the Spirit of the Lord was with him. We'll see this morning. And mostly with his conflict with the Pharisees. But also the third thing that we're going to run into this morning is this continuing pattern, things we've already seen in Samson's life, is his desire or his demand for women. In that first chapter 14, he says to his parents, "I've seen this woman, go get her for me." And we saw how that went after that and what a terrible thing that was. So as we get to chapter 16, we're going to see this again. Chapter 16, verse 1. One day Samson went to Gaza, which you wouldn't know this. It's a Philistine city. There are 5 Philistine cities, and I don't even know if I can remember them all. Ekron, Gaza, Gath. If you ask me some other time, I'd probably remember it, but I can't remember right now. But there's 5 of them, and this is one of them where he saw a prostitute. So meanwhile, what's he doing there? Gaza is actually the farthest away of the Philistine cities from where he's supposed to be in Israel, so he's gone a long way from home. We should probably note that. And he went in to spend the night with her. It seems, as we already mentioned, that every episode of Samson's life starts with his desire for a woman. And here is yet another one. And you know about Delilah. We're going to see in a few verses. You remember that we had the woman from Timnah when he said to his parents, "Get her for me, I've seen her." And now we have a prostitute who lives in a Philistine city. And you already recognize from the pattern that has developed in Samson's life that the author of Judges already gave us that this is probably not going to be a good thing, and he's probably going to be misled or deceived by this woman. Verse 2, the people of Gaza were told Samson is here. So they surrounded the place and lay in wait for him all night at the city gate. They made no move during the night, saying at dawn we'll kill him. Maybe he'll be groggy in the morning and he'll be weak or whatever. We can take advantage of them. But notice that they know who he is. They know where he is and what he's done. And they are now seeking revenge. Because we did not mention this, but this back and forth between Samson and the Philistines is a constant thing in his life. Happens all the time. He'll fight them. They get revenge and try to capture him. Then they do something to him or his family. He'll go back and kill a bunch of them. And it's just back and forth this entire time. So now they know who he is. They know where he is. In the morning we'll capture him. Verse 3. But Samson lay there only until the middle of the night. Then he got up and took hold of the doors of the city gate together with the 2 posts and tore them loose, bar and all. He lifted them to his shoulders and carried them to the top of the hill that faces Hebron. Now, this was probably part of the story that your Sunday school teacher showed you, and I don't know if you remember what the flannel graph looks like, but certainly the one that I remember did not do this story justice. Because what you need to note here is notice the part that he took hold of the doors of the city gate together with the two posts and tore them loose, bar and all. This is not like the little chain link fences that we have, right? This is the gates of a city in these times that Samson's living in, literally had meeting rooms in each of them. There was literally two sets of gates with meeting rooms in between, so if there was warring parties, they would meet in those middle rooms, or if there was battle, the inside people could drop people down inside to those meeting rooms. So this is a massive thing that he has carried. The second thing that you would note without noting this is how far he carried it and where he carried it. It says he carried it to Hebron, but that's 40 miles away from Gaza. 40 miles he carried these gates that he ripped up out of the ground. I also would point out that at this point in the story, what is the most intriguing thing to me is there's no mention of the Spirit of the Lord in this part of Samson's story. There is in several other parts when he does supernatural things, but in this part, there is not. You remember, I think the last time we talked about Samson, I posed to you the thought, did Samson look like he was physically imposing? Or did he just look like a normal man, and then when the Spirit of the Lord came on him, supernatural things happened? I think Samson looks like the guy in those pictures up there. I think he's a pretty strongly built guy, and perhaps it's just the author has just decided not to tell us at this point that the Spirit of the Lord was with him. But where he's carrying these gates is 40 miles away, and it's uphill all the way. So remember those stories your parents used to tell you that they used to walk to school in the snow uphill both ways? Samson is carrying the gates of Gaza uphill to Hebron. Now the reason he's going to Hebron, it is the leading Israelite city at that point. It's almost as if these gates of this city Gaza are a victory of war, a spoil of war. He's carried him 40. Can you imagine how exhausting that is? I can barely carry myself out the back door. And this guy's carried these gates 40 miles uphill and gives it to like the leading Israelite city. He says, here you go. It's on. It's like another, just like everything else that he has done, and we're going to see again next week, Samson likes people to know that he's a strong guy. He didn't have to carry it 40 miles. He could have just ripped it off and left it right outside and said, well, now you have to rebuild your gates. No, he's got to carry it 40 miles uphill. It's this triumphant announcement, and perhaps he's even declaring there's a new battle about to begin, and we're ready for this. So verse 4, so that's another story. This is the second woman in Samson's life. Now comes the third in verse 4. Sometime later, we don't know how much time, but again, Samson's story is going to start with his desire for a woman. This time, though, it says he fell in love with a woman. Now, let's not get too carried away because the word there might not mean love, it might mean lust. All right, we're not quite sure. It can mean both at times. So, but nevertheless, it did not say that about these other two women that have been part of his life, even the one that he wanted to marry. So he fell in love with a woman in the valley of Sorek whose name was Delilah. Now, nowhere in this story is it going to tell us that she fell in love with him. It does say that he fell in love with her. Interesting thing that the author's done here, this word Delilah sounds like the Hebrew word for night. And there's a lot of debate. Commentators suggest a lot of different things. Others have said it's from the Aramaic meaning of the night. And I think what's going on here is her name might even be Delilah. The author's trying to tell us something. There's another idea is that it's a flirt or a flirtatious sort of thing, that maybe she is appealing to him. She's flirting with him at that point, and that's why he uses this name Delilah. Nevertheless, every suggestion they come up with all have the same idea, that she is appealing to him somehow. And again, there's nothing to tell us that he desired or did marry her. Verse 5, the rulers of the Philistines went to her, realizing that Samson is attracted to her, and went to her and said, see if you can lure him into showing you the secret of his great strength, and then how we can overpower him so we may tie him up and subdue him. Have we not heard this before? Remember his first wife? This is almost the exact same story. There's a little more to it this time as the woman from Timnah in chapter 14. He said, see if you can find this out for him, how we can overpower him so we may tie him up and subdue him. Now the word subdue can also mean torture. They're going to pay him back for what he's done. And we know how this is going to go. And then they say, each one of us will give you 1,100 shekels of silver, which is a number that for us doesn't mean anything because we're not used to a shekel, until you dig into it and you realize that this is more money. It's actually 3 times the amount that Gideon captured in chapter 8 from all 5 Midianite kings. Basically, if it's each of the leaders of Philistine, if there's 5 leaders, this is 5,500 shekels, which still doesn't mean anything to us until I tell you that it is literally 550 years of wages. They mean business. They have offered her 550 years worth of wages for this transaction. Now, my Sunday school teacher never told me that, so I'm telling us today that when you teach this story in the future to young children, make sure you impart upon them how much money this is. Whether or not she fell in love with Samson, she's been offered a lot of money here. So Delilah, right immediately, she says to Samson, "Tell me the secret of your great strength and how you can be tied up and subdued." Almost literally word for word what the Philistine leader said to her. And apparently she's interested in the money. So as this happens, kind of portray this event happening in your mind. How did this play out? What was the nature of this? Is Delilah and Samson just hanging out one day, and she says, "You know what? Just out of curiosity, how would you be subdued? How could somebody take you and capture you? You know?" And in that moment, does he realize what's going on or not? Or is it just kind of a back and forth, And just out of curiosity, on a whim, she asked this question. Now, at this point, hopefully to all of us, since we've seen this story play out before, hopefully every one of us realizes what Delilah is doing. According to the story, it looks like we all know except for Samson. Unless he is toying with her and he continues to play this game that he did with the other woman as well. It seems, though, that he might be incredibly and ridiculously clueless, but we've seen that before. Remember, we talked about his father, Manoah, and his cluelessness about when the angel of the Lord comes to him, and he says, "Oh, no, we're going to die. We've been in the presence of the Lord." And his wife says, "He just gave us all these promises. He's not going to kill us," right? And we thought in that moment, Manoah is clueless. Maybe Samson has got hereditarily some of this buffoonish stuff from his father. So verse 7, she's asked him just on a whim, how could we tie you up and be subdued? Verse 7, Samson answered her, "If anyone ties me with 7 fresh thongs that have not been dried, I'll become as weak as any other man." Then the rulers of the Philistines brought her 7 fresh thongs that had not been dried, and she tied him with them. So we've got to assume that some time has passed. She's got to deliver the message. 7 thongs will do it. They bring them back to him. Then another day she says, "Hey, let me tie you up with these, and she wants to try it," right? She's just kind of flirting with him, playing with him, and let's see what happens. But now, what he doesn't know in verse 9, with men hidden in the room, she called to him, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." Now, how soon after they delivered these thongs did they hide? Was this immediately? And, I'm just curious to how this plays out in reality. Of course, Samson, the Philistines are upon you, but he snapped the thongs as easily as a piece of string snaps when it comes close to a flame. So the secret of his strength was not discovered. Once again, he didn't tell her. Then Delilah said to Samson, "You've made a fool of me. You lied to me. Come now and tell me how you can be tied." Okay, she's persisting in this. Is it still as if she's just kind of curious, still just playing, or is he starting to get a clue about what's going on here? Does he not realize what is going on? One commentator says about this passage, it is a very odd way that we might think that she has of cajoling him into confiding in her. He says, wouldn't it have exactly the opposite effect? The more that she tries, wouldn't he harden himself and realize that she's trying to find my strength? And he suggested this. The answer is no, for 2 reasons. First, since the secret of Samson's great strength is what every Philistine wants to know but cannot, for her to ask him to reveal it to her alone is to tell him that she wants to be his soulmate. She wants to be on the inside. She wants to be closer to him than anyone else. She wants to know him as no one else does, to be as close to him as only a lover can be. And in a paradoxical way, it is a declaration of her professed love for him. She's basically a wife calling out to her husband, although she's not a wife, says, "Let me in. Let me know who you are. What are your deepest secrets?" And since Samson, for his part, already loves her, it's a challenge that he's going to find hard to resist. So the second reason might be that it shows us just how well she knows him. She knows that Samson is the kind of person who is aroused by danger rather than repelled by it. Let's acknowledge that is true. He's not very ran from anything. He's all in on the lion. He's all in on everything he can do to kill the jawbone of the donkey and all that. He is actively engaged, up for the challenge. She challenges him to live dangerously with her and to revel in the excitement of it. And again, it is something that this particular man, who has never fully grown up, will find hard to resist, and Delilah has read him well. I think for either of those two reasons, and maybe both, that's probably right. She knows what his weak spot is. Now, whether she knew about his story earlier with the wife from Timnah, we don't know. But she's going down the same path. So verse 11, he's going to try again. He says, if anyone ties me securely with new ropes that have never been used, I'll become as weak as any other man. That's exactly what he told the woman that he was supposed to marry back in chapter 15, verse 13. He says, if it's just new ropes, that's the key. Verse 12. So Delilah took new ropes and tied him with them. Then with men, again, hidden in the room. And that phrase has occurred twice. There's guys hidden in the room. Where were they hiding? How big is this place that there's guys hiding? She must have truly believed that the second I get these thongs and these ropes on him, you guys can come in and he'll be good to go and you can capture him. So as soon as they come, she calls to him, Samson, the Philistines are upon you. But he snapped the ropes off his arms as if they were threads. Delilah then said to Samson, until now you've been making a fool of me. You've been playing with me and lying to me. Tell me how you can be tied. She's going to try again. This is the third time now. And I think at this point he does know, and I think he's toying with her, and he's going to now use her to bring the Philistines to him. Because remember, these two times she's tied him up, the Philistines have come out, and he's realized, it doesn't say what happened to those Philistines, if he killed them or they ran away or whatever. But now he's realized that the first two times she asked me this, there were Philistines nearby. So I'm going to give her another reason, and I'll be ready for him this time. So she says to him, tell me how you can be tied. You're making a fool of me. Next, verse 13. He replied, if you weave the 7 braids of my head into the fabric on the loom and tighten it with the pin, I'll become as weak as any other man. Now, I can remember even in Sunday school getting the idea, now he's toying with the truth. Because we're talking about his hair, right? Because they told us in Sunday school that his hair was the secret to his strength. It's actually the only part of his vow that he's not broken yet. But now he's starting to give her just a little bit of truth with the lie that he's going to tell her. So while he's sleeping, of course, we know what's going to happen next. We see it coming. Delilah took the 7 braids of his head, wove them into the fabric, and tightened it with the pin. This time it's not about ropes or bowstrings. He's dancing around the truth, and he's starting to hint towards what it might really be. Now the interesting phrase there in verse 14 where it says, tightened it with the pin, is the same phrase that the author used back when he was talking about, you remember the story of Jael and Sisera, the female judge, where she drives the spike through the guy's head? That's the same phrase that he's using here. We have not forgotten what the author of Judges told us back there. We can sense that this is now a female who's going to into the death of this man, and he's using the same phrase. So again, she does that, and again she calls to him, Samson, the Philistines are upon you. He awoke from his sleep and pulled up the pin and the loom with the fabric. Then she said to him, how can you say I love you when you won't confide in me? And you sense there's a little more, she says a little more this time. There's a little more heartache, a little more heartbreak. And we know that she's really just in this for the money. She says, this is the third time you've made a fool of me and haven't told me the secret of your great strength. Verse 16, with such nagging she prodded him day after day until he was tired to death. The ESV says his soul was vexed to death. How many days that is, I don't know. But it's going on, day after day after day. You've done this. She's asked him 3 or 4 times now. He's never told her the truth, and she just keeps on until she gets this. Verse 17, now that his soul is vexed to death. So he told her everything. No razor has ever been used on my head. Now we know that previously he had 7 braids. So if you think about a lifetime, we don't know how old he is. His hair is pretty long, but if he puts it in braids, it'll at least be manageable. He should be able to fight. So we know he's got these 7 braids. He said, because I have been a Nazirite set apart to God since birth. Also answering another question that hopefully you had, did Samson know he was a Nazirite? Certainly his mother told him. We know from this verse right here that he does know that he's not supposed to touch dead bodies, that he's not supposed to drink alcohol and eat the grapes and all that sorts of thing, because he's now telling her, if my head were shaved, my strength would leave me. He says this is the final straw, and I would become as weak as any other man. And she must have heard this and thought, how could I have missed it? Right? Because here's this guy with 7 massive braids of hair who's stronger than everyone else. His hair had to be longer than everyone else. And now he tells her the truth. She's got to go, how could I not have known that, right? There's some interesting things going on in this passage right here with what Samson says. If my head were shaved, my strength would leave me, And then what does he say? And I would become as weak as any other man. Not as weak as any man, but any other man. So one of the things that as I was studying this week, the commentators pointed out is that in this part when he says, because I have been a Nazirite set apart to God since birth, he's not using the Hebrew name Yahweh. He's using just a kind of a generic term for God, Elohim. So first off, he's not ascribing his power to the true God of Israel. And he also assumes that this vow is now going to be the last straw. If his hair is shaved, he's going to lose his strength. We see that. But as I said, several commentators suggesting something that I've never thought of or considered before. And more than one. They suggested that with this phrase, that Samson is kind of tired and he would actually prefer to be like any other man. Perhaps he's tired of all the battles and all the wars and all the back and forth with him and the Philistines. He's tired of Delilah day after day after day trying to find out the secret of his strength, and he's just kind of exhausted from all of it, and he's ready to give up, which I had never considered at all and had to consider seriously this week because more than one commentator suggested that. But he's been in constant conflict, constantly stirred up to anger and revenge against the Philistines. Perhaps this being a Nazirite became an unbearable burden for him. Imagine all the things that have happened in his life to this point. Let's follow this line of thinking for a moment and review Samson's life. So Samson is called by God from before his birth to this Nazirite vow. And this was intended to be a temporary vow that you willingly took on. For Samson, it has been something from before he was born. The first story that we get of him in Judges is that he is manipulated and betrayed at his bachelor party by his fiancée. Okay, there's probably a little bit of hurt involved there, even though he was not entirely blameless. And the result of that is that he goes and kills 30 Philistines to pay off the debt for their solving his riddle. Then the next part of the story is that his future father-in-law gives his bride to his best man. The result is he catches 300 foxes, ties them together, sets their tails on fire, and sets them loose in the field of his enemies. Keep in mind, this is not a normal human life that we're considering. There's a lot of back and forth, a lot of bitterness and envy between these two. The next part of the story is because he's such a threat, his own people, the Israelites, the Judahites, it tells us in chapter 15, they agree to turn him over to the Philistines. His own people are betraying him. The result then is that he kills 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey. So keep that parts of his life and then apply it to, is he really tired and exhausted and done with all this? He has spent his entire life fighting against the Philistines. And these are just the stories that we're told of. There may have been many more. The commentator suggests that this is ultimately what Samson wants, is to have his hair cut. And to just be any other man, to live like anybody else. He no longer wants to be the Nazirite warrior. And again, I'll say I've never heard this before until this week, but I wanted to throw it out there, and perhaps as you have some time this week, think that through. He's now resigned himself to just live a simple, humble life with Delilah and forego any future battles. Now he's kind of foolish to think that that's all that's going to happen, is he's going to lose his strength, that the Philistines are going to let this stand. But here's the question. Is it possible that Samson realizes that this is the last part of his vow to be broken, and he does just want to live as any other man? There's a place for us to jump in here a little bit and think about this. We have all likely been in difficult situations and circumstances, and we just wish we didn't have to fight anymore, and that the battle was over. We live in a world that will likely never give us earthly peace. But we do know how we can find spiritual peace. There's a place of rest even in the midst of earthly battles. As I said, Samson's foolish to think that the Philistines are going to let him live in peace. He's been raised, for the phrase from Esther, at such a time as this. And maybe you need to hear this today, Christian, disciple, follower of Christ. You may not, and probably do not, and will never feel as strong as Samson. Most often, and God's people said. This is a man with supernatural, superhuman strength, and we are supposing the idea that he's just had enough. He's just tired. He's exhausted spiritually, emotionally, physically. We saw that the Spirit of God left him, or is going to in a few moments. But I bet that you have felt this desperation that he feels. I bet you have felt that you just wanted it to be over. You wanted the battle to be done. And you may feel that you can't fight any more battles. Well, I want you to stay with me until we finish this chapter, until we get to verse 22 today. But we've got to find out where we are. Will peace finally find Samson? Look at verse 18. When Delilah saw that he had told her everything, she sent word to the rulers of the Philistines. She's sending for the big dogs this time. She knows that I finally got the answer. Come back once more, he's told me everything. And once again, Samson is betrayed. So the rulers of the Philistines returned with the silver in their hands. They now believe her, right? Before it was going to be COD. We'll pay you when we find out if it works or not. But now it's like she must have given them enough assurances that this is the real deal, so they bring the money with them. So having put him to sleep on her lap, oh, what a subtle, nice picture it is, isn't it, right? She called a man to shave off the 7 braids of his hair, and so began to subdue him. Talk about the worst job in the world. Hey, I've got the world's most strongest man. You're going to help me weaken him. Come and cut his hair while he's sleeping. I do not want to be that guy. Because I know about Samson. I know the heroics that I know all of my people that he's killed before. I'm not volunteering to be the guy that cuts Samson's hair while he's sleeping. But that's what happens, right? It's probably the quickest haircut ever given. But anyway, so she begins to subdue him, and some commentators suggest that she actually did it herself, but for me, according to the text, it looks like she called somebody. Verse 20, then she called, Samson, the Philistines are upon you. He awoke from his sleep and thought, I'll go out as before and shake myself free. Now look at this phrase, but he did not know that the Lord had left him. This is the phrase of his life. Everything turns right here. We've seen more than any other judge that the Spirit of the Lord is with him, but he did not know that the Lord had left him. I want you to think about this for a moment. It is possible that when you started to work, when you became a Christian, God's hand of blessing was on you. It's also possible that in times of stress in our lives that we try to do things on our own and we think it's okay, and we do not recognize that the Spirit of the Lord has left us. It's a terrible thing to think about, but it's a reality of what happened in Samson's life. It's possible that God is no longer a part of our work and we don't know it. We've gotten so used to this daily grind, the daily battle, that we just go about the work doing what we do and we don't even notice anymore that God isn't with us. And I know I'm not the only person guilty of trying to do things on my own, because this is what's got to happen today. This is the schedule. This is what we do. And we come to the place when we don't know that the Lord has left us and there's no more purpose, there's no more power, there's just plodding, just performing. So what happens in Samson's case, verse 21, then the Philistines seized him, gouged out his eyes, and took him down to Gaza, where he's been just earlier in this chapter. Binding him with bronze shackles, they set him to grinding in the prison. So Samson loses his eyes. Interestingly enough, the one thing that was a problem for him in the first place, his wandering eyes for women. His eyes have been his problem, and now that the Lord has left him, he loses those as well. It was Samson's eyes that led him astray in this earlier story, not just at this part of the story. And now this man who's done supernatural things is doing the work that any other man can do by grinding in the prison. He got his wish. We'll finish Samson's story next week, but we want to wrap up today with our conclusions. The Sunday school version of this story that we were told as kids, and I thought about this a lot this week, is that Samson was being deceived and the loss of his hair, right? That's the big deal, the loss of his hair. But as usual, as we work our way through the story, we recognize that there might be more going on. Remember how just a minute ago I talked about how Samson may be weary of the battles, done with the fight, tired of all the back and forth with the Philistines? Well, I want you to see that. Look at how the author concludes this section, verse 22, with a sentence that I would say drips with foreshadowing. Some would say that this sentence is pregnant. There's something about, you can see it in this line. Verse 22, look what happens. That in the midst of this rejection, his eyes gouged out, grinding in the prison. Verse 22, but the hair on his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. Now, there's one thing about this verse that I don't like. It presumes that when his hair grows back, he's going to get all his strength. I don't like the fact that the author presumes that God is going to... Now, the author knew what happened, that God did, but I still don't think that Samson's hair was the key to his strength. I think it's the Spirit of the Lord. So I would take a little bit of issue with that, but I'm not the author of the book of Judges, and he wants to feed this little pregnant line to us that because his hair began to grow again, things can change. So I would say to us this morning in conclusion, when it seems that the story is at an end, because for Samson it looks like that's where it is. He's just going to spend the rest of his life grinding grain in the prison. When it seems that the good times are over and that all hope is lost, God is about beginning again. In Samson's case, the hair on his head began to grow. Lamentations 3 says God's mercies are new every morning, and we can see now that even though his eyes have been plucked out and he is grinding in prison, he's not abandoned, he's not forgotten, he's not forsaken. But maybe that's how you feel today. Abandoned, discouraged, just tired. Lonely, maybe even unforgiven. I would say that just as God did with Samson, as his hair begins to grow, he can renew you and you can begin again. I'd say as we close our time this morning that you can always come and be renewed, be strengthened, be forgiven. We and you and I do not have the strength of Samson, but we have enough for this week for God to help us get through it. So I'm going to pray, and if you want to come into the altars and pray and seek that strength, the altars are open. If you want someone to come and pray with you, someone will come and pray. So let's pray this morning as I invite you to the altar. Father, we thank you this morning for, again, the power of your word to see something again and something new that we had maybe not thought about before. We see the strength of Samson and we marvel at this and what you did in his life. We also see his weaknesses and we see our own exhaustion, our own failures, our own discouragement. And realize that even in the midst of this discouraging story, you are doing something. You're doing something in us to encourage us, to strengthen us, to renew us, to draw us close to you. I pray that in this hour, through the power of your word, the presence of your Spirit, and not just here, but in the week ahead, you would bind up the brokenhearted, proclaim hope to the hopeless, peace to the restless. And God, if we are not ourselves in that situation, may we be your tools to do that in the life of someone who is hopeless. To declare the good news, to declare the promises of God and the hope that we have. We thank you and we commit this time to you this morning. Again, thanking you for the power of your word. And all God's people said, amen. Would you please stand with me this morning? We want to close. I want to remind you of the great hope that we have. Where our power comes from. We may not have long hair. We may not have taken a Nazirite vow, but God is still good and faithful because the blood of his Son Jesus still is stronger and there's power in the blood.